I'm Daniel Sanford. I'm the director of the Center for Teaching and Learning. There are two main messages that we talked about in this workshop, and they both come from after a long history of teaching writing and also working with faculty on the teaching of writing. I think they're the most important two lessons in my experience to talk to people about. So the first is shorter writing. There's a lot we do in academic writing, which is very long. We tend to privilege long writing, and I think it's just the perfect example of something in higher education that we do just because it's what we do. There's just a history and a track record, and so when we're designing a course, we tend to think back to our own college experiences and graduate student experiences, and design courses based around what we experienced as students. And a big 12-page research paper at the end of the course is like one of those canonical course things. When you look outside of academic writing, long writing is rarely privileged. Like, it is much more the case that brevity is a skill that is important to master as a writer. It's hard to be brief. And some of what often people find most maddening about college student writing is exactly because students are being asked to write really long things, where people are trying to be as kind of profuse and wordy as possible to try to fill pages. So I think one approach that I love, which is what John Bean calls micro themes, or the leverage principle, which is asking students to write things which are very short, but in order to write them, you have to have a pretty robust understanding of the topic. And then the inverse of that for us as instructors is the things that we're grading and responding to are very short pieces of writing. And by short, I mean maybe just a paragraph long, like 500 words or less. And then it puts us in a position of being able to comment on people's understanding of the topic instead of commenting on how closely have you aligned with the conventions of a particular genre of writing or what we expect from college writing. So in my courses, and I teach linguistics, almost all of my writing has become micro themes. So assignments like, explain to your roommate who's never taken linguistics in an email how this idea that we just talked about in the course works. Very short pieces that try to get at people's understanding of complex topics. And then the second piece that I think is really, really important that we talked about in this workshop, and again, that I think is, I found it really helpful advice as a teacher, and I think it's eye-opening for many people, which is, it's a very clear research finding that when our comments that we spend all of this time, lovingly putting on student papers, often very late at night, when those comments are accompanied by a grade, the research really clearly shows that students don't look at that feedback. College students are sort of conditioned to know that that's the end of the process. So you get the grade and then you shove it in your backpack. So those comments may never get looked at. The earlier in the writing process people get comments, the more likely they are to read them and respond to them. So one thing we talk about is strategies for moving that feedback closer up. And in terms of saving time, I think the most important thing for people to know is that those comments don't have to come from you. They can come from other students. They can come from writing tutors. They might come in conferencing. They don't have to come and writing down comments, but there are a lot of ways you can structure things so that students are getting feedback that they'll pay attention to without that having to be comments that you're writing at the end of a big grading cycle alongside a letter grade. I got lucky in the funny academic path that I took, in that before I ever taught in my discipline, linguistics, I was able to teach freshman English. So as a graduate student, I taught English 101 and English 102 when I was a master's student before teaching in my discipline, which is linguistics. So I learned a lot of great tools that writers use, which I never would have been exposed to had I gone straight into teaching my discipline. And then, all of the jobs I've had as an educator, teaching and, being a CTL director and being a writing director and all the different things I've done, the most important experience that I've ever had in pedagogy was being a writing tutor, because I just found it so incredibly eye-opening. It just changed every preconception I had, to change my perspective from what it feels like to be, speaking at a group of students, to what it feels like sitting in the writing center and students come in with their questions, because students are so good at performing that they know what they're doing. And as an instructor, it's so easy to talk to the few nodding heads in the front row. And as a tutor, you get to know kind of reflexively, like, okay, what are the places that students aren't following along and they're just acting like they're following along, but it's going to show up later. So with respect to writing, a lot of the approach that I've come to in teaching in my discipline is grounded in some of the tools that I learned from compositionists in my time in the writing center, and in my time teaching writing, and in my time as a writing director. There is so much that composition has to offer of research-based principles. The field knows what works in teaching people writing, and knows what works in terms of pedagogical approaches for doing so. So I think it's stuff that's worthwhile paying attention to. I'll give maybe just 2 suggestions for things to try if you haven't before. I heard for many years the advice, try out a grading rubric before I actually did it. And that's because I thought it sounded like a really big thing to do and time-consuming thing to do, to sit down and make a grading rubric. When I finally did one, of course, I was really happy I had. So now when I give people the advice to try grading rubrics, I understand that hesitation, because it is time-consuming. So the advice I would give is just devote one semester to, as you're grading your writing assignments, as you keep writing those things that, like, we all have them, they're the things that we end up writing in a bunch of student papers. Maybe it's your pet peeve, or maybe it's just a pattern in your class, or maybe they're the things that really matter to you in your students' writing. Just as you write those on a bunch of student papers, awkward, or good argument, or needs more evidence, whatever those things are for you, also put them on a rubric. And you make a rubric just by, the simplest form is just make 3 columns, good, medium, and bad. And then for each outcome of that writing assignment for you, organization, evidence, whatever it is that you're trying to get across in that assignment, just with those comments, as you paste them in, just describe what papers look like in each of those categories at each of those levels. And then the next semester, you'll have your rubric all built and ready to go. And it makes grading so much faster, because then you're not writing those comments. You're just underlining or circling them on the rubric. And the second thing I would suggest people try out, many folks have tried peer review and found that it didn't work well for a variety of reasons. And my leading piece of advice there is, it can really make a difference in terms of your student writing and in terms of the time you spend grading, but it's helpful to flip it. We often think about peer review of, like, we trade papers and I look at your paper and I give you feedback, and then you implement that feedback on your writing. I think it's a really useful switch to think of it in terms of, we switch papers. I look at your paper. As I look at your paper, I think about what's good here that I would want to emulate, and what's not working here that I can also think about in my paper. And then I give your paper back to you, and then I look at my own paper and I say, okay, how can I try to be a little bit more like the good things that I just saw in this other paper? And how can I try to avoid some of the hazards I saw? As we all get a lot of experience grading writing, it's really easy for us to look at a student paper and really quickly get an idea for, is this working? Is it not working? Like, is it falling into one of the common hazards of student writing? And we can give our students the same benefit by just giving them the opportunity to view other students' writing.